Everybody, this is Clint Lanier, professor of rhetoric and professional communication, and I'm going to talk today about bad newsletters, what they are, and especially how to write them. We'll go over the importance of bad newsletters, why I'm even bringing up this subject. We'll go over their purpose, and then we'll look at two different methods. There's the direct method and the indirect method, which is the one that we're going to focus on, and we'll provide some examples of how to achieve kind of the indirect method to achieve the purposes that we've defined. So why is this important? Why is this even a question? Well, understand that one of the most common types of communication in the workplace is negative communications. For example, you might have to write performance reviews and evaluations of coworkers or of employees, say if you're a supervisor, for example. You might also need to deny requests for things. If you are in HR or if you are elsewhere in an organization, it might be important to deny somebody's request for something. And then, it's always, nobody wants to do it, but you might have to terminate an employee, for example, or in general, just give somebody bad news. You might have to give bad news to a customer. For example, maybe they request something and you have to say, no, you can't have that for whatever reason. So these types of communication, negative communication, happens all the time in the workplace, and it's really important to understand how to structure negative communication to achieve a good outcome. So understanding how to deliver bad news is an important skill in any professional setting, certainly in anything outside of college. Okay. People always ask me, can I just tell someone the bad news and get it over with? And this is probably the most commonly used method of delivering bad news. Well, it depends on a variety of factors, but primarily it depends on the purpose. What is the purpose of the communication? Well, if you want to deliver bad news as quickly as possible, that's fine. That's a good purpose, and with that type of purpose, simply telling somebody bad news is probably the best way to do it. But there might also be some other outcomes that you are pursuing. For example, what would you do if you wanted to keep a customer? What would you do if you wanted to keep a client, for example? Is simply telling them something, delivering bad news, saying, sorry, you can't have that, or we're denying your request, is that the best way to go about that purpose? Well, how many customers or clients might be offended by getting some bad news and no longer solicit your store or your business or whatever it happens to be? What if you also want to keep goodwill with a former employee? You certainly don't want employees out there speaking ill of you or leaving bad reviews about you or whatnot. You want to ensure that, for example, if you were to terminate an employee, that at least you are separating on good terms. So that could be another purpose. And maybe you want to ensure that there's no hard feelings among coworkers or among those people that you supervise if, for example, you have to deliver a bad evaluation or something. So there are a lot of other purposes, and they'll all vary, but it's never simply as easy as delivering bad news. If you simply deliver bad news, some people refer to it as just rip off the Band-Aid, a lot of these purposes might be lost, okay? But whatever the purpose is, I think it should include all of the following. You want to ensure understanding. I think at some level you need to, the person that you're delivering bad news to needs to understand why the bad news is being delivered. So what is happening? Why did I get a bad evaluation? Why did I get fired? Why can't you approve my request for a day off or whatever it happens to be? You want to ensure that they understand the reason for the bad news. You also want to minimize blame. Now, let's say, for example, that an employee requests a day off and you have to tell them that no, they can't have a day off. Well, who's to blame for that? Why are you not allowed to give them a day off? Typically, it's not because you're mean or somebody's a jerk or whatever. It's probably because of company policy. So the blame doesn't rest on perhaps a supervisor for denying a day off. It would probably rest on the company policy. And that's where the blame should be shifted, and that's where it should be clear that that's where it's coming from. You also want to maximize acceptance of the bad news. You want them to, whoever you're delivering bad news to, you want them to understand and accept it so that they aren't left trying to renegotiate whatever it is they're trying to do. You want them to say, okay, well, I understand, that's fair, and that's just kind of the fact of life. And then finally, you want to minimize communication after the fact. You want to minimize communication after you've delivered the bad news. So in other words, if you do happen to fire somebody or terminate their employment, you don't want to be hearing back from them over and over and over again 2 or 3 months afterwards. Likewise, if a customer contacts you about something and you have to deny them perhaps a request, you don't want them contacting you again, and so forth. Now, a lot of the reasons they would contact after the fact or communicate after the fact is because those first 3 were not fulfilled. So in other words, if they don't understand why they were fired, they will contact you afterwards. If they blame you for firing them, then they might contact you afterwards. And then finally, if they don't accept the fact that they were fired or whatever the bad news happens to be, they will probably communicate to you afterwards. So in order to achieve that 4th one, a very, very important 4th one, you want to ensure that the first 3 are achieved as well. Now that last one also becomes very important if you understand that time really is kind of precious in the workplace. In other words, time costs money. And if you are dealing with these communications after the fact, then it's taking you away from being productive on other tasks. So all 4 of these purposes must be understood, and they must somehow be achieved when writing some type of bad news communication. So again, I mentioned there are really 2 methods for delivering bad news. There's a direct method and an indirect method, and let's look at both of those in turn. The direct method is exactly as it sounds. It leads with the bad news and then it follows with the explanation. Okay, so it tells somebody this is what happened and this is why that happened. So here's an example. Dear Mr. Sullivan, I'm sorry to inform you that we have been contacted by the IRS and you are the subject of an examination, commonly referred to as an audit. The IRS performs examinations throughout the year, either randomly or because some aspect of a tax filer's history stands out. In your case, we were told that you are the subject of a random examination that will look at your tax filings over the past 5 years. Please give us a call if you have any questions or concerns about the process or its consequences. Thank you. So here's a bad news letter. The bad news is that somebody is getting audited. That's set up in the very first paragraph. The reason why they're getting audited is in the second paragraph, and that's really about all it says. Well, the problem with this type of method is that it's hard to get past that first paragraph. If you've ever been audited, I imagine it's a very, very scary event. So if that very first line scares you, imagine how difficult it will be to understand the second line. You have to understand that when people read, we read with our emotions. We also don't just simply read something and then understand it and move on. We argue with something we're reading. So if somebody says, if the bad news was, for example, you're fired, the first thing we want to know is why. Even if the explanation follows, we're so mad at that first line, we're so mad at being fired or sad or upset or whatever, it's hard to really understand that second line. That's, again, it's human nature. So that's what this type of method leads to. It leads to, it's hard to understand why, so maximizing understanding is very, very difficult in this type. There's also the blame factor. Who's to blame for this particular scenario? Well, I guess it would be the IRS is to blame, but that doesn't really stand out. If I'm getting this from my CPA, that's probably who I'm going to shift the blame to. And lastly, it really doesn't give me much more information, like what next? What are the next steps? What do I have to do? What's expected of me? So I'm going to be contacting the CPA or whoever wrote this letter and say, okay, well, what do I do now? So it's certainly not minimizing communication after the fact. So, and as far as goodwill is concerned, again, it's a very, very kind of sudden. It's like a jolt to the system. So I might be upset. Maybe I'll think, especially if I think that it's the CPA's fault that I'm getting audited or examined, as they call it, well, then that's where the blame lies, and I probably won't want to be their customer anymore. And actually, let me give you a little full disclosure here. This happened to me. The CPA that was doing the books for one of our businesses, we got audited, and that's exactly who I blamed, was the CPA. I didn't blame anybody else, and I am no longer their client. My business, the business that this had to do with, is no longer the client of that accounting firm, because that's where the blame lies. So I guess that's where I got this scenario from. So that's the direct method. I don't think it does a very good job of achieving those purposes of shifting blame, of minimizing communication after the fact, of maximizing understanding and ensuring goodwill. It doesn't do any of those things very well. So as I mentioned, the problem is human nature, and our emotions often block our cognition, or what we think about, or the decisions we make. It's hard to make good decisions if you are upset. It's hard to make good decisions if you are sad or mad about something. That's why we often say, the best thing to do is, if something happens, let's say you get a bad email, the best thing to do is not to answer it right away. The best thing to do is to close your email, take a deep breath, do other things, come back to that email, and draft a reply after the shock of something has worn out. This is something I have to physically do, because I have received bad news emails before, and my first instinct is to reply immediately and yell at whoever sent that to me. It took a lot of time for me to learn that the best thing to do is just to minimize my window, minimize the email, walk away, take a deep breath, and then come back. And that's human nature, and that's our emotions when we read. So the direct method shocks the reader in this way, and they are unable to rationalize. As I mentioned, they will lose goodwill, enhance the blame, and likely contact you after the fact to ask, why is this happening, and to try to better understand the situation. So it's not going to be very effective if you want to achieve any of those purposes. The solution is the indirect method. It has a very, very specific structure that you should probably remember and use. You start with a positive opening, then you move to a discussion of the rationale, then you give the bad news, then you propose some type of solution and discuss that, and then you close with some type of positive information. This will do all of those things that we're trying to achieve, those purposes that we laid out a few slides before this. The positive opening allows you to transition into the subject of the letter and put the reader at ease. The discussion of the rationale provides the reader with a discussion about why the bad news happens, without ever actually presenting the bad news. This is important. We're not going to deliver the bad news, we're just going to provide rationale that will lead to the bad news. The goal is to ensure the reader knows why whatever is happening is actually happening. By the time the reader gets to the next section, they should know what's coming, they should know the bad news that they're about to receive, they should understand why it's happening, and they should agree with it. So that's what this discussion of rationale is supposed to do. It is perhaps one of the most important, probably the most important part of the entire document or entire communication. Then you move to the bad news. It's a very clear presentation of the bad news. Next, a solution. This presents an idea for solving the bad news, if possible, that will help the reader out. And then finally, a positive close. Now here's an example. Dear Mr. Jones, on behalf of myself and everyone who works for Simon Accounting, I want to say how much we value your continued patronage. We look forward to a great new year and hope to serve you more. The IRS understand that at times business owners will want to purchase items as gifts for employees or customers. According to IRS Publication 463, small business owners who can, quote, deduct no more than $25 of the cost of business gifts you give directly or indirectly to each person during your tax year, end quote. The rule was put in place to ensure business owners do not try to expense elaborate or improper expenses. So for example, if I bought each of my clients a $20 gift card, I could deduct each card because they are less than the $25 per item per person threshold. So here we have the positive opening. On behalf of myself and everyone who works for us, I want to tell you how much we value. Then we move into the rationale. Now I haven't stated any bad news here yet, have I? All I've done is I've provided them information about a particular subject. In this case, the deductible amount that you can deduct from gifts given by a small business, which happens to be $25. I've also provided some type of authority. I said, according to the IRS Publication 463, and then I give them the quote directly from that publication. Moving on, I deliver the bad news. According to the files you turned in, you are reporting 10 gifts of $50 each for your 10 employees. Unfortunately, this is more than the IRS allows, and so you will not be able to deduct the full amount. So that's the bad news. They're not allowed to deduct everything that they wanted to deduct, the $500 total. Instead, they can deduct $250. In the future, should you have any questions about what expenses are deductible for your business, excuse me, we would be happy to provide advice free of charge to ensure the situation does not happen again. So then I give them a solution for the problem. And then finally, a positive close. Thank you again for your continued patronage, and we look forward to another great year of serving you. Sincerely, so on and so forth. So this will do, the combination in this example, will do everything that we set out to do. Okay? It will ensure or build goodwill with ourselves and our client. It will enhance understanding, right? Because we've told them exactly what they need to know in this second paragraph. It will also minimize blame, because the blame isn't the CPA or the accountant. Who is the blame on? The blame is actually on the IRS, and that's exactly what I told them here. According to the IRS, and then I give them this. It also ensures acceptance of the bad news. There's nothing we can do about this. This is simply how it is, according to the IRS. And it probably will minimize any contact after the fact. There's nothing that they have to reply to. There's nothing that they have to worry about answering. There's no questions they have to answer. There's nothing they have to do. It's simply stating this is kind of what's going to happen. So I think this will achieve everything that we want it to achieve because of using the indirect method to deliver bad news. Now, there might be times when you want to use the direct method or when you should use the direct method, and that's fine. But when you come to circumstances where you have to deliver bad news to a client or to a coworker or to an employee or something like that, try to use this method. Try to use the indirect method and deliver that bad news. And remember that the indirect method has a very, very specific structure. Let's look at that again. Positive opening, discussion of the rationale, bad news, discussion of solution, and then positive close. Okay? One more time, I just want to reiterate on that second paragraph. That's the most important. I want you to look again at the steps I take here. I don't want them to blame me, so I find a way to give a citation for the IRS or credit the IRS for this problem. Therefore, it's the IRS's decision. It's not mine. Also, I'm not providing any bad news here at all. Notice that, again, there is no bad news in this paragraph. It's not until the second paragraph. Now, if I was the business owner and I was reading this, I would start thinking about what I tried to deduct on my taxes, which were $50 gift cards, and I would think, oh, I can deduct no more than $25. Oh, that means that those gift cards I gave to my employees, I can't deduct the whole amount. That's what I would be thinking if I was the business owner that would be drafted to. So therefore, I haven't even gotten to the bad news. I already know what the bad news is, and I've accepted it because, again, it's the IRS saying it. It's not the CPA that's saying it. Okay? So final thoughts. Again, spend as much time in the rationale section as possible. Right? Provide a reference or citation for that rationale. That's where the blame is really going to lie. It's not going to lie on you. Plus, it's also going to provide credibility for what you say. If I were just to tell you, oh, you can't deduct something, well, you might think, well, how do you know that? You know, what makes you think that? And so you might ask me after the fact, which again is not achieving our purpose of minimizing communication after the fact. If possible, use direct quotes, because that's like somebody else telling them that. So in other words, if I just tell you, oh, you can't deduct $50, that's fine. But if I say the IRS says, quote, you can't deduct $50, end quote, it's the IRS talking at that point. It's not me talking, and that minimizes the blame because, again, it's not my fault. It's a rule that the IRS has. If the language is complicated or complex that you give them, so if that quote that you use is complicated or complex, you need to redefine the quote or information in a plain manner so that it is more understandable, right? If you look at my other presentation on audience or on Prios, one of the things we want to do is ensure that the audience, that the reader understands the information. Okay, so if, and again, I'm going to use the example of an accountant. If I was an accountant and I directly quoted the Internal Revenue Code, IRC, chances are it's going to be very complicated language about very complicated things. Okay, if I were to do that, I would then try to explain that quote or that language and define that stuff so that the reader understands. Now, one of the best way to do that is to use examples. In the previous case, if we look back at my example, at the very bottom of the second paragraph, I say, so for example, if I bought each of my clients a $20 gift card, I could deduct each card because they are less than the $25 per item per person threshold. So I provide an example that is not unlike what they actually did. They tried to give $50 gift cards to each of their employees. So I provide an example that clearly discusses what the rule was that I just put in place. That's very, very important if you can find an example to do that. Okay. So again, this is the indirect method of delivering bad news. This is the preferred method to deliver bad news. That's the structure that we use, and those are the purposes that we want to have for the indirect method. If you are one of my students and you have any questions, feel free to email me. Otherwise, if you have any questions, feel free and leave a comment down below, and I'll try to answer it just as soon as I can. Again, this has been Clint Lanier, Professor of Rhetoric and Professional Communication, on writing a bad newsletter and delivering bad news. Thank you.